Good afternoon. My name is Brent Plate. I'm the chair of AAR's Religion and the Arts Award jury. This year's awardee, of course, is the reason we're all gathered here, and I'd like to welcome you to a conversation with Gary Snyder for the next 90 minutes. The AAR Award in Religion and the Arts is presented annually to an artist, performer, critic, curator, or scholar who has made recent and ongoing significant contributions to the understanding of the relations among the arts and religions, both for the Academy and for a broader public. If you would like to nominate someone in future years for the award, please email me, see me later after the show here, or check out AAR's website. They have full details there. A couple quick but important words of thanks are in order. First, I'd like to thank my fellow members of the jury, Diane Apostolos Capadonna, Sally Promi, and Norman Girardeau. Great group of smart, creative, and diligent people with whom I've been working over the past 5 years on the Religion and the Arts Award. Finally, I'm going to turn things over to Mary Evelyn Tucker, who will moderate the rest of the session. Mary Evelyn herself has been instrumental in helping to put this session together, so I want to publicly express my gratitude to her work as well. Mary Evelyn, thanks.
Good afternoon. I'd like to begin actually with a poem of Gary's, written in '69, I believe, a prayer for the great family. And those of us who've been working much later on religion and ecology might take note of how early Gary was speaking about these things. And after a Mohawk prayer, as he suggests at the end, this prayer for the great family: gratitude to Mother Earth, sailing through night and day, and to her soil, rich, rare, and sweet. In our minds, so be it. Gratitude to plants, the sun-facing, light-changing leaf and fine root hairs, standing still through wind and rain. Their dance is in the flowing spiral grain. In our minds, so be it. Gratitude to air, hearing the soaring swift and the silent owl at dawn. Breath of our song, clear spirit breeze. In our minds, so be it. Gratitude to wild beings, our brothers, teaching secret freedoms and ways, who share with us their milk, self-complete, brave, and aware. In our minds, so be it. Gratitude to water, clouds, lakes, rivers, glaciers, building or releasing, streaming through all our bodies, salty seas. In our minds, so be it. Gratitude to the sun, blinding, pulsing light through trunks of trees, through mists, warming caves where bears and snakes sleep. He who wakes us. In our minds, so be it. Gratitude to the great sky who holds billions of stars and goes yet beyond that, beyond all powers and thoughts, and yet is within us. Grandfather space, the mind is his wife, so be it. How can we approach the creativity of a writer and public intellectual such as Gary Snyder? One can't fully, for he has given us an abundance of poetry and prose over the last 6 decades. But one can touch lightly on the remarkable contributions he has made across our literary landscape and into the inscape of our minds. For he sweeps away the pretensions, makes space for emptiness, and invites us into the alive, flowing world. And this flowing world is mountains and rivers without end, as well as Turtle Island, and all the places on Gary's journey in between. The forest lookouts, the ocean steamers, the back streets of San Francisco and Berkeley, the narrow alleys and temples of Varanasi and Kyoto. And let us not forget his companions on the way. Coco Pele playing the flute in Canyon de Chelly, the ravens croaking in Haida Gwaii, the rhesus monkeys flying wildly in the forests past Non Ren Lake. Gary's journey led him during the 1960s and even earlier to Japan, where he explored those volcanic islands, from walking on remote mountain ridges to seaweed-rich beaches, from cooking and eating yamano-sachi to umeno-sachi, gifts of mountain and gifts of the sea. His grounding bioregion was Kyoto, where he lived, worked, and meditated amidst the rake gardens and pine trees of Shokokuji. There, the silence of midnight sitting sesshin may slice open the heart. Several years after Gary left Japan, I followed him in those footsteps to Rinzai Zen temples in Okayama and Kyoto. But Gary carried his Zen practice back to the South Yuba River watershed in the foothills of the Sierras, where the real work continues. There, for the last 35 years, the sound of the Zendo bell mingles with the forest bird song and community celebrations. But to build a community, he has shown us, is not a romantic task. It takes fierce discipline, flexible muscles, and a good axe. Indeed, the precision of making and measuring an axe handle was impressed upon me as I searched in vain for the reference in Chinese sources to this art in my own studies of a Japanese Neo-Confucian thinker, and there it was in Gary's poem, Axe Handles. Gary's skillful fusion of the practical and the poetic, of the East Asian and the Native American, of the Bodhisattva and the coyote, make him unique among writers anywhere on the planet. He is erudite and crafty, a master of the brush and literary traditions repossessed. And to what end are his skillful means applied? Where does his upaya practice point? With images that are at once brilliant and ordinary, he opens us up to a space where, quote, the awareness of an emptiness brings forth compassion. For this alone, we draw on the Japanese honorific and cite Gary as a living national treasure, himself embodying wisdom and compassion. But there is more, always more to Gary. From the Pulitzer Prize for Turtle Island in 1975 to a Guggenheim Fellowship, from becoming a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, he continued to write and teach, establishing at UC Davis the Nature and Culture program. How fortunate were those students for so many years. So Gary, you who have reminded us that Mother Earth loves to love, you who have opened us up to the interpenetrating pulse of life in passages such as these, and I quote, mind in the mountains, mind of tumbling water, mind running rivers, mind of sifting flowers in the gravels. At the end of the Ice Age, we are the bears, we are the ravens, we are the salmon in the gravel at the end of the Ice Age. Our wish for you, Gary, is the brilliance of the blue sky, deep turquoise, sparkling azure, glowing lapis lazuli. May this be your blessing way as you have shown us ours. Please welcome Gary Snyder.
Oh my gosh. You see, you said too much. You're supposed to stand up afterwards, I thought. Don't have to. Mary Evelyn, thank you very much. Well said, you know? Articulate. We have a little time here today. I'm a little bit boggled and also very grateful to have been invited to participate in this. I'm boggled because I'm finding myself willy-nilly, by being here even, in the midst of a huge mainstream America. You know, like a big mainstream hotel, which I couldn't find for a long time with my car, going this way and that way on. I thought I knew downtown San Francisco, you know. Boy, I didn't realize that they're on mission, you know, if you really want to drive in here. And then it's not a very user-friendly place. You know, I got into the wrong line once. I was in the lobby and found myself talking to the concierge. And she said, "Oh, no, you have to go over there to check in." So I'm just a country boy from way up in the Sierra Nevada, where I have lived, and this is not boasting, it's just I had no choice, for 40 years off the grid. 40 years of, the first 15 years of kerosene lamps and candles. Since then, solar panels, backup generator, gradually improving the wiring, getting a really decent inverter to convert the 12-volt electricity to alternating current, 110, and finally, actually, a really good generator. It takes years, you know, to learn how to do that, and also to afford it. I want to spend my part of it here. I've been asked to speak for 20 or 25 minutes and read a poem or two as part of that, which I will do. And then there are a couple of people on the panel here that have some questions for me, they say, which I'm sure I can answer. I can make something up. And after that, we'll take some questions from the audience, which is always fun. And I urge you to harass me. So I want to start with saying something about the United States of America, which is part of North America, as we all know. And North America is preferably to be called Turtle Island, although I don't expect the people, you know, I don't expect a large number of Americans to do that for another 100 years maybe. But eventually, the term America will be recognized for what it is, a transatlantic name from a past that we are long divorced from, no longer part of, a continent in the new hemisphere going its own way, as it inevitably will and is right now, finding our way in doing so. I find myself on the edge of that process of leaving Europe behind and moving into a creative future which we don't quite know what is involved, even with a people and a culture which is underway, genetically and culturally and in every sense underway. Hard to say what language will be the main language spoken on Turtle Island 500 years from now. Maybe a Creole of English and Spanish with a lot of Chinese and Japanese mixed in. How's that?
Yeah, sounds good.
I'm looking forward to Catholic Confucianists, too. Being as there will be and are right now different Americas, I just want to say I'm from one of the different Americas. I'm from my family for several generations, Pacific Northwest, although my mother was originally born in Texas. My grandfather, a homesteader in Washington when it was still a territory. Were and are all secular. Came through working class grassroots socialism. My grandfather soapboxed for the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, Yay. Pioneer Square on Yesler Way in Seattle. And I never saw that. I was too little, but my father told me about it. My father was a union organizer on the Grand Coulee Canal, Grand Coulee Dam, and was actually out of work during the Depression for 7 years, but got a job finally as the war started with the Veterans Administration because he had been a Marine in World War I. That was the preferential treatment that he got for that. And so I was raised without religion, and I certainly didn't miss it. In fact, what I was raised with was a very strong ethic of racial tolerance. My mother from Texas, from the South, would tell me the way my people talked when I was a little girl down there about black people, except she didn't say black, she said Negro people. She said, I couldn't tolerate that now. I know how bad it is. And she would go on at some length to explain why one should not engage or allow oneself to have the least shred of racial prejudice. Something which naturally I absorbed totally because I didn't have any idea why not, to be totally open and free that way. Well, there were a lot of things like that. She was also, however, open enough to the idea of culture that she put my sister and me for a little while in a Lutheran Sunday school for the culture. She said, well, you ought to know something about that. And about that time, we had a little dairy farm. About that time, one of our heifers died. I don't remember why or how, but she was a heifer that I was pretty fond of, and I worked on the farm, of course. I milked cows, took care of the chickens, helped out in a lot of ways. So I asked the Sunday school teacher, will my heifer go to heaven? The answer, poor fellow, he didn't know how to, finesse it, said no. And I remember thinking, and I probably said too then, I'm not going either. And that was the end of my Sunday school career. A little later, at some point, I ran across some drugstore magazine that had a little box on Buddhism and Hinduism. And what I picked up on, I must have been no older than 9 or 10 then, what I picked up in that was that they believed that you should have a moral and ethical attitude of care and non-harming, if possible, towards other sentient beings, so that the precept, thou shalt not kill, did not apply only to human beings, but applied to all sentient beings. And I didn't have to think very far with that one either. I said, well, that makes sense. That must be right. And I tucked that away in the back of my mind so that a little later in my mid and late teens, when I started reading other things from here and there and ran on to Buddhism, Hinduism, Gandhi, nonviolence, all of that, it seemed quite right and appropriate. And from that time till now, one of the things I have always held to is this question of ahimsa, non-harming, which is the proper translation of ahimsa. The idea of, if not absolute purity and nonviolence, a skillful means in finding the least harmful ways to behave. At the same time, I was really interested in the Native American life and culture, which was not too far away from us. We lived right between, our dairy was right between the north end of Lake Washington and Puget Sound. And there were elder men with flatbed, one guy had a Model T truck that came by once a month selling smoked salmon, a Salish Indian gent. And we would buy some smoked salmon from them when they came by. We visited little communities along Puget Sound that were still Puget Sound Native communities, with some of them still with traditional wooden canoes without boards attached to them for getting around out on Puget Sound. They were doing a lot of fishing then, and they still are. I went to a lot of trouble and practice and thought to find out how you can live off the land without a high technology. We were backed up against second growth forest where the stumps were 8 to 12 feet across and 10 feet high. I realized later that where we had our little farm north of Seattle was in the aftermath of one of the world's great clear cuts in one of the world's finest temperate zone conifer forests, the big Douglas fir forests of the Puget Sound area, which provided the lumber for building the houses of San Francisco and Los Angeles about that time, by lumber schooners going down the coast under sail, not under steam. They still had a few of those sailing lumber schooners when I was a little boy. So I also was a hunter and a trapper. I also fished. And oddly enough, I felt no contradiction in that, or I did sometimes, but I worked hard to find out why I didn't have too much of a sense. And that drove me onward into really studying and living Native American ways to understand how to be a subsistence hunter and gatherer and at the same time cause the least harm and at the same time truly honor the beings, the animals or the plants that you might be eating. That is a remarkable challenge. And it's a challenge that the indigenous world of every continent has come up against, and most of them have really remarkably well handled it. And in the simplest language, they handled it by knowing that they should say thank you. In a way, that's the great lesson right there to begin with, is to say thanks. When you do something, get something, use something. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Nobody does it, though. Very few people do it. And the culture as a whole definitely does not do it. And there is a huge number, numbers in the millions, of cows, sheep, and pigs that are being slaughtered every day in concentrated feeding, industrial meat-making packing houses. It numbers in the millions, and nobody is ever saying thank you. So there's a place to start right there. We do have a tradition of saying grace, at least in some households. I carried all those thoughts with me and my evolving sense of nature as being a web, as being a community, on into my college years, and discovered the discipline of ecology at a time when ecology did not mean necessarily virtuous outdoorsmanship or environmental morality. It meant the study of energy transactions among organisms and also the inorganic, the energy transfer, the energy exchange, which it's still basically in the realm of ecological science is wonderfully working at. But I thought of that as also community, because I never somehow got away from the idea that if I belonged to a community or a neighborhood, it included all the critters in it, which would be the birds, the raccoons, the skunks, the occasional bobcat. Where I live now, the not-so-occasional black bear, who's there a lot, and the cougars, who come through more regularly than you might think, taking care of any excess deer. We have less deer now than we did 25 years ago because of the comeback of the deer, of the cougars. And that is a good thing, because the purchase of hunting lions, hunting licenses in California has dropped considerably. And hunting pressure is way down on the deer herd. And that is exactly the potentiality, the gap into which the cougar population has moved and is very comfortably exploiting. I bet you didn't know that. Yeah, it's interesting to watch. When I managed to get into a college and start doing longer and deeper studies in history and philosophy and so forth, liberal arts, all that, I got wind of East Asia. Actually, I majored mostly in anthropology. And a couple of things from East Asia. One was a trip to the Seattle Art Museum. Another was a Chinese veteran of World War II who came in as a GI Bill student, and a man in his 40s already. This was in Portland, Oregon, who kind of took Philip Wayland, Lou Welch, and myself under his wing to teach us, first, how to use chopsticks. If you don't know, you better find out, because it's a lot better if you do it right. And then he taught us, he insisted that we read Confucius. And so I got my first volume of the Analects. I think it was Lin Yutang's translation. And I started reading the Analects, and of course that was delightful. And then he made us read the Tao Te Ching. And when I read the Tao Te Ching, the Lao Tzu text, for the first time, I felt I finally had a language that I could think in and talk about nature in. By nature meaning not just the ordinary outdoors sort of meaning of nature, but nature as process, and the natural world as an expression of that process, the natural world that we see. Well, anybody who's read my book, The Practice of the Wild, will perhaps remember the first chapter where I go into those definitions in more depth. And to put it simply, I now use the word nature to mean the phenomenal universe, which is the way scientists use it, physicists use it, the Greek physis, and that leaves an opening for another term, which is wild nature. That being the part of the phenomenal world, the territory of the phenomenal world, that is least impacted or not impacted at all by the agency of human beings. But we have to confess, that toxic wastes, nuclear power, and all of that are perfectly natural. If they weren't natural, they couldn't happen because they would violate natural law. What does that leave? Among other, it leaves us two territories. One is wild nature, the other is the supernatural. The supernatural, some people say, is perfectly natural. The supernatural, some people say, is a figment. Others make a lot of it. I'm with Confucius most of the time in saying it's hard enough to figure out what to do with this life without worrying about the next one. That led me towards a deeper study of and a more exhaustive study of East Asian and Southeast Asian and Indian subcontinent texts. And I found myself roaming around in the translations of Pali Buddhism, what was available from the great Puranas of India, the great mythological texts, and then Mahayana Sutras, the further developments that happened within Indian Buddhism, which include Vajrayana and the Buddhism that went to Tibet, and then finally back to China, where all of these, or almost all of these schools of Buddhist practice were transmitted in Buddhist philosophy, and ultimately learned, which is something that it took me a long time to figure out, that Zen Buddhism, or as they say in China, Chan Buddhism, was still alive and well being practiced in Japan, minimally practiced in Japan, but it was there. And it was when I realized that I withdrew from anthropological linguistics graduate school at Indiana University to enter the Department of East Asian Studies at UC Berkeley and seriously started studying classical Chinese and contemporary Japanese. And that took up 3 or 4 years of my life while working summers as a backcountry laborer for the Forest Service. So that's where I got into being a lookout. I was in between graduate student stays in Berkeley. As I realize now, I got interested in China for the wrong reasons. I thought it was a very nature-loving, virtuous country with a high civilization and an enormous amount of literacy that had somehow crossed the civilization barrier without losing touch with the natural world. That's only partially true. Large central governments never worry too much about nature. And the interest and support for the natural world that you do find in some parts of India and China, and very much in Tibet, are often running against the grain. Thus, the greater part of central and North China was totally, practically speaking, totally deforested by the 14th century. If you want to check this out further, you can read a book called The Retreat of the Elephants, which is a magisterial account of the history of the Chinese environment, starting with, about the 5th or 6th century BC, when elephants and rhinoceroses were a common animal in the forests of the southern half of China. And there is record of that down as late as the 2nd or 3rd century AD. Elephants, aren't tropical necessarily, nor are rhinoceroses. But that moves into a later era, and gosh, I can't remember the name of the guy who wrote it. I'm having a blank. But he is now teaching in Australia. At the time he wrote this book, he was at Princeton. How do you find out what the original forest cover of North China was? You look for the imperial tombs. The imperial tombs of China, as in Japan, going back for centuries, were fenced in with big stone fences and the trees allowed to grow. Everything else got cut down around it. And that gives you a few samples of some really old trees here and there in North China. Otherwise, what they have to do is dig down and get soil profiles. And if you get down a few feet and you get a new soil profile, what you find is that it was a deciduous hardwood forest with a lot of chestnut and beech and elm in it. That which is today the valley of the Yellow River and is almost entirely turned over to agriculture, not necessarily just rice agriculture. That's only in the marshes. When they converted the marshes to rice lands, they also ruined the habitat for an awful lot of animals. Although the migratory waterfowl, such as all of the crane species, are still, trying to come down to the wetlands of China, Vietnam, Korea, the island of Kyushu in Japan, and so forth. Latest good book on the cranes of Eastern Asia is Peter Matheson's book, Birds of Heaven, covering 8 or 10 species of crane that raise their young, nest and raise their young in the Siberian Arctic, and who winter in various places down into Southern Asia or Central Asia, and a number of whom at one time flew over Afghanistan regularly on their way to their wintering grounds. And you can imagine how a few migrating cranes flying up at about 6,000 feet is where they like to fly, or I mean 6,000 feet above the ground, not just sea level. Flying up 6,000 feet above the ground when somebody called the United States drops a 500-pound shock and awe bomb. And it seems as though the migratory waterfowl that used to go over Afghanistan are still very puzzled and what's left of them is trying to figure out if they should go there again or not. You know, these are things that are not considered in ordinary dialogues in the civilized Occidental or developed or even undeveloped world. And understandably so, human beings come first, as all of the Tea Party types would say. Human beings come first. That's a very difficult argument to get into, and I won't try to do that now. So I'm describing how I came to actually getting to Japan with my own determination to get some first-hand Buddhist practice, and entered some of the training halls of Shokokuji Honzan, major central Zen temple, and the Daitokuji Honzan, another major central Rinzai headquarters, and spent as long as I possibly could. My teacher died, Oda Setsuo Roshi, to engage in the traditional, entirely orthodox, absolutely unaltered koan study practice as it had been, you know, for many years, many centuries of previous Japanese time, and very likely not very much changed from 11th and 12th century China, which is when they started seriously bringing a lot of that over from China to Japan. Though Buddhism the earlier types of Buddhism were first carried to Japan around the 4th or 5th century A.D. Tiantai and Shingon and some of those really elegant large temple philosophical schools were getting established in Japan around the 12th century, 13th century, and Zen was coming in right in the 14th century. So that's a history. I just came back a little over a week ago, from 10 days in the Tokyo area, where I gave 2 large talks in 2 different Zen temples to the lay assembly, the nice, ordinary, middle-class, middle-aged, not too old, men and women in equal numbers, supporters of these big Zen temples, most of them not, really trying to do hardcore Zen study. Most Japanese people are smart enough not to do that. But taking questions from that audience and talking about Buddhism with that audience was really an eye-opener, again, because they're just beginning to become really environmentally aware, and it takes, having a major nuclear accident to reinforce that. And so everybody's talking about the Fukushima reactors right now, but they still have a very strong memory of having been hit with the atomic weapon twice, the atomic bomb, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But what they really wanted to talk about was the dilemma of the last 100 years in Japanese Buddhism, which is, should they or should they not have allowed, made legal, whatever it took, for Japanese Buddhist priests to marry in the 1870s. And this is still a big question. The Koreans reversed it after the Japanese pulled out. They reversed what the Japanese had said. Why don't you priests all just get married like we do? They reversed it, and they kicked all of the married priests out of the Korean Buddhist Sangha, sent them back to lay life, where I'm sure they're doing well. So the Korean Buddhist world is now, again, a celibate, or a theoretically celibate world, as is China still, for what there's left of it there. And that, of course, is also true of Tibet, the Tibetan Buddhist world. I consider myself in the Daitokuji line of Rinji Chan or Rinzai Zen, but I consider myself as a very unreliable character in relationship to that, to head off criticism in advance, if nothing else. And one has to do that, one does that because partly one realizes that in the East Asian world, There is a lot of slack given to people who have stayed around long enough to become somewhat established, and they don't get fired from their job if they get mixed up with somebody's wife. Nobody ever talks about it. Japan is still a culture in which there is a front and a back, and what happens in back never goes public. And even if everybody knows it, it doesn't go public. And what happens in front, of course, is what your reputation and what your position in society or in politics is. It took me years to learn that my own Zen master, Roshi, had a wife somewhere. And what the problem was, actually, the problem in Japan, and what they're facing up to now, is that in a society in which, in a Buddhist society in which there are marriages, but they have not actually resolved the question of how open they should be about it, the women play a secondary role. They have to sort of be secret, a little bit secret, and sort of stay in the back of the temple. And that's not healthy. And it's not healthy for the children that grow up in that. So what I say to my friends in some of the Zen centers in San Francisco is, you guys are creating the same problem the Japanese had. You just don't know it. But this is, I'm not supposed to talk about all that. We did start up in the Sierra Nevada 30 years ago, a practice there carrying on a somewhat modified Rinzai Zen style and building a Zen-do building with pine trees from the woods and boards cut at a shade tree sawmill by an old guy from Arkansas, and figuring out where to get everything and knowing, in a sense, darn near which tree every board came from and where that tree had grown. That was still possible, to know your trees, your boards, your woods that well 20 or 30 years ago. It's becoming less, it's not as easy as it was now to keep track of that, because the sawmills are run by more professional people than that now. But it's not impossible. So, that is a huge step away from the industrial world of construction and building that most people know. And it's wonderful to have a temple, a zendo, on which almost all of the practitioners worked as laborers and carpenters and can all feel that it is a building that belongs to them. In my own thinking and reading, I am constantly extending my thought and my curiosity to the whole breadth of the Buddhist experience, but I am not attached deeply to most of it, and I'm not concerned to try to work out the contradictions that are in it, obviously, because one of the characteristics of the whole Buddhist tradition is they don't mind being contradictory. Just as the Zen tradition itself does not mind being contradictory, or that is even part of its training method. It will say, no dependence on words and letters, a direct transmission from mind to mind. And they will say, when you first go into a Zen teaching establishment, don't read any books, just meditate, just learn to meditate. What you find out later is what they mean is, you're going to have to read a lot of books later. And you are also expected to know all of that history of India, China, Korea, Japan, especially in the Buddhist world, and to know the texts, to have a good grasp, a basic grasp of what the texts are. You're supposed to have read those books and you're supposed to know them, but you're not going to talk about it a whole lot. Not until you get into 8 or 10 years past just learning to sit and meditate. Meditation is a great practice. I've indulged myself in reading books all my life. and in a wide-ranging intellectual curiosity that is not indiscriminate. That is to say, I draw the line at a lot of places and say, that's not my business and I can't go there. But balancing the need to know about the world we're in and its history against your religious or spiritual practice is a very interesting exercise. And what meditation basically is, spend time with your mind without any particular input other than what you see there, what you hear there, what you feel there. Become grounded in your own existence, your own conscious existence, rather than utilizing it all the time for some agenda that you have. Be agenda-free for a while with your own mind, with your own being. Of course, when I say mind, I mean the mind and the body. They're all together. When you start meditating, you forget where the boundaries are, and it's not certainly all in the so-called head. You're thinking with your entire body, and you're feeling with your entire body, and that's one of the lessons of this kind of practice. And that whole school, that whole line of what we call religion, the Buddhist line, is remarkably free of abstract ideology because it starts with the very simple observation: everything is impermanent, and all beings will experience rapid dissolution. They won't be here for long. Is that then a world of suffering? Yes, for a while, or it's maybe a word for a world of, the word is dukkha in Sanskrit, and it doesn't exactly mean suffering. It seems to mean it's a bit frustrating. And there is consequently all the way through, there's no real promise of an afterlife that anybody would pay any attention to. Curiously enough, it is focused on becoming aware of who and what one might be in one's own mind, what that mind-body being is, and in that process, losing a lot of the ego and anxiety and defensiveness that might be there, so that you forget that you're not everything, you are everything, or you can share in everything. That becomes part of the Buddhist process. I dropped in earlier today. Got to keep track of time. Oh my gosh. I'm going to quit in a second. I dropped in earlier today in here to hear Richard King, the author of Post-Colonial Theory and the Mystic East, who spoke in this room. Gee, I was so surprised I didn't know he was going to be here. So I sat in the back and listened. And it was a remarkable little riff on post-colonialism and how we are sitting right now on the edge of the end of the so-called developed world and the end of the hegemony, or I don't know, he said hegemony, I would say hegemony, of the power of the United States in the world. But here's what he said about Buddhism a few years ago. Consider, for instance, he says, the example of Buddhist philosophy. In ancient Buddhist thought, there has been no postulation of an all-powerful deity, nor of an immortal soul constituting our real and essential identity. The spat between the church and the secularists simply did not occur. In contrast, Buddhist philosophy and practice is grounded upon a realization of the impermanence, anitya, and fluctuating nature of the self, anatman, and a deeply empathetic realization of the interconnectedness, pratitya samutpada, of sentient beings as impermanent, multifaceted, and relational, and relational processes. Given the virulently anti-essentialist stance of most of Buddhist philosophical traditions, there could be no possibility of an appeal to a universal human nature or essence as a unifying principle or ethical praxis. Similarly, the sheer radicalness of the Buddhist rejection of an abiding or essential self will allow for no postulation of a sovereign or autonomous subject at the center of history. Nevertheless, ethical praxis within the Buddhist tradition remains firmly grounded in a recognition of the universality of suffering and the fluidity of boundaries dividing the different species of that all beings experience in their innumerable embodiments of flowing together of samsara. Indeed, it is our non-essentiality, anatman, the relational nature of our existence that we share in common. Thus, Buddhist philosophical culture allows for a recognition of the universality of suffering among all sentient beings, not just human, and the cessation of this state of affairs as a primary and universal objective. Now, I am not suggesting that post-colonial theorists should become Buddhists in order to avoid the Scylla and Charybdis of contemporary post-colonial theory. The introduction of this anti-universalism of ancient Buddhist thought into the debate at this point is deliberately disruptive. My intention is not to argue that the Buddhist position is superior to Western worldviews, only to induce a recognition that it is significantly different. And that's what I have come to feel over the years, that whatever it is I'm doing and feeling is significantly different from what the mainstream is doing, and yet it feels okay. I was asked if I would read a couple of poems also, and I'm going to. I'm going to read two poems from my latest collection of poems, Danger on Peaks. Danger on Peaks referring first to the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980, the first mountain I ever climbed when I was 15. But moving on, in time to impermanence, suffering, disturbance, and fun and ecstasy too, through all of that. So I'm going to read two poems that are in an old Japanese style of haibun, that is to say, a prose paragraph and then a very short poem. This is called For Anthea Corinne Snyder Lowry, my sister, 1932 to 2002. She was on the Marin County grand jury, heading to a meeting south of Petaluma on the 101. The pickup ahead of her lost a grass mower off the back. She pulled onto the shoulder and walked right out into the lane to take it off. That had always been her way. Struck by a speedy car, an instant death. White egrets standing there, always standing there at the crossing on the Petaluma River. And this poem is from Kyoto, Japan. It's called The Great Bell of the Gion, one of the largest bells in the world. Maybe the largest is there on the east side of Kyoto, where the Gion Shrine is, the Gion Shrine and Park. Named after the Park of Jetavana in India, which in 500 BC was a place that the historical Buddha periodically stopped and taught at. So they brought a 2,500-year-old, from 2,500 years ago to the Gion Shrine and Temple in eastern Kyoto only 1,200 years ago to keep that going. Quote from the Heike Monogatari, "The great bell of the Gion Temple reverberates into every human heart to wake us to the fact that all is impermanent and fleeting. The withered flowers of the Shala tree by Shakyamuni's deathbed remind us that even those flourishing with wealth and power will soon pass away. The life of fame and pride is as ephemeral as a springtime dream. The courageous and aggressive person, too, will vanish like a swirl of dust in the wind." Heike Monogatari, 12th century. So, we were heading back to our little house up in Murasaki No, returning from the Gion Shrine on New Year's Eve, with a glowing wick handout from a priest. Lit in the New Year sacred fire, started anew by the bow drill, purified, walking and lightly swinging the long wick to keep it aglow, in a crowd of people whirling wicks and heading home. Finally, catch a taxi. Once home, start a propane gas plate from the almost gone wick. Now we have a sacred fire in the house. The Gion's huge bell still ringing in the new year, as soft, as loud at the house 3 kilometers away as it was at the temple. Up along the Kamo River, northwest to higher ground, after midnight New Year's Eve, the great bell of the Gion, 108 times, deeply booms through town. From across the valley, it is a dark whisper, echoing in your liver, mending your fragile heart. Thank you.
Okay, you guys can ask me questions.
Gary, thank you so much.
Should I stand here or should I
I
sit
think
down?
that's either way.
Okay.
Yeah. So now we have a panel of some Buddhologists and East Asianists and dark green religionists. And so very, very briefly, maybe I'll just introduce each of you. And if you want to start, you were anyway, Chris Parr got his degree at Boston University in literature and religion, and now teaches East Asian religion, literature and arts and religion, now teaches East Asian religions at Webster College. Chris Ives has been one of the leading Buddhist scholars, especially of Zen, and is teaching now at Stonehill College outside of Boston. And Bron is at University of Florida and has been very influential in the field of religion and ecology, and editor of the Encyclopedia of Religion, and another book which is being discussed this afternoon on dark green religion. So, would you like to start?
I think I was.
Yes, good, okay.
So I have a two-part question. Over the years, you've emphasized practice in various senses. The practice of writing poetry, the practice of zazen, the practice of honing practical skills, the practice of the wild, the real work. So my first question is, at present, what is your main practice? Not that there's one, but what would be for you right now your central practice? And then as a follow-up question, at present, how do you look at the practice of writing poetry? And more specifically, at present, do you see the writing of poems as an expression of, or a way to deepen your realization of what you've called in the past original mind?
That's a big jump from poetry to the regional mind. But, okay, praxis. Ascesis, Theoria, and Praxis. Those are the 3 foundation stones of much of religious practice, much of religion all over the world. There's plenty of theory in Buddhism. There's plenty of ascesis, and there's plenty of practice. But practice, I think, comes in as being of most importance. And in the case of Buddhism, there is not a creed. It is not a faith. If, as some Tibetan guy said, if you're out walking on a trail on the Tibetan plateau day after day, and you cross paths with somebody finally, the questions you ask each other are not, what is your creed, what is your faith? The question is, who is your teacher? And what is your practice? That's the question. And so there's two meanings of practice, and you get to these two meanings right in the heart of downtown Buddhism. The first meaning of practice is, well, what is it that is of a practical and repetitive, dedicated nature that you do in a regular way? Do you get up early every morning? Do you only eat vegetables? Do you sit for 2 hours every day? Those are practices. And they they may be very useful, but then at some point, maybe not. There's a whole debate about when to not be shaped into something that lacks fluidity and becomes rigidified by practice. Practice is to learn from, not to become a pattern for an entire lifetime. But basic, so to speak to my own situation, basic Zen practice is to have a little time to meditate every day. I am retired from being not only a professor at the University of California, Davis, which I did for a while, but I'm also retired from being one of the teachers at the Ringabone Zendo up in the High Sierra, where I live, though the building is only 5 minutes walk away. I have my own little Sangha. Now, you know, Buddhism is the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the three refuges, the three treasures, I mean. The Buddha being we used to say the human teacher. I would now say the sentient teacher, because it might be a bear or a cow that is the Buddha. No, that's really true. Not right now, maybe, but later. It may well be that, well, you know, some of the big Mahayana sutras, I love those big Mahayana sutras. They say, oh, in some universes there are Buddhas in forms that we can't imagine. That Buddhas take all kinds of, and they also teach in all kinds of ways, sometimes without language. So that's a very open territory. Anyway, the Buddha, the Dharma, the truth, whatever it is, even if there's no truth, that's the truth. And the Sangha being the community. And in its limited and narrow form, that means the community of fellow practicers. In its largest meaning, it could mean the phenomena of the earth itself, the organic and inorganic items of all sorts that are interacting and flowing together with each other constantly is a kind of community. Or, might as well think about it as galaxy upon galaxy. What the heck are they doing? And do we need to even ask that? Okay. So there is a practice, and my practice is, to answer your question, I like to chant. So every morning after I get the coffee made, sit down, get the incense going, light the candle, sit on my zafu, bring the little bell over by my knee, get my mala out of the bell where I keep it most of the time, and put my notebook on the left in case I think of something I should do later. Have a sip of coffee, start ringing the bell, and I do the same set of sutras, chanting them from memory, that I was taught by my very first Zen teacher, Miura Isshu Roshi, in Sokoguji in Kyoto in the spring of 1956. I was his inji, his personal attendant for a full year. And I cooked breakfast for him every morning, which he finally learned to eat. I mean, I didn't know how to make Japanese breakfast, so I made bacon and eggs. And then he said, you have to sit with me and do the sutras. And so we went to the Buddha altar and sat down on the tatami, and he lit the incense and all, and led off on the sutras. And after a couple of days, he said, well, you're supposed to memorize them too. And so I did. I memorized the whole bunch. And I can still remember most of them, and the ones that I can still remember is the ones I chant. Then I sit, meditate for a while, and then I get into the day's work. And if I'm lucky, the day's work starts with raking the garden, sweeping the leaves, sweeping the pine needles, because that's what we get tons of. So that's one meaning of practice. The other meaning of practice, which is more important, is living every moment mindfully and doing what you do, what your life has given you, what your karma has proposed to you, whether it's waking children and blowing their nose, or changing the oil in the car, or going out in the dark and doing something in the garage or the shed. Whatever life calls for you to do, finish the accounting, go talk to the dentist, follow up on your appointment with your lawyer, and take some food to a person who is sick and is back from the hospital, and everybody in the neighborhood is volunteering to take different meals at different times. So whatever the world has given you to do is what you do, and that is practice. And the approach to that then is to be mindful, non-judgmental, cheerful, not a patsy, not exploited at the same time, knowing just what the right balance is there, and to do it in good humor. That is an interesting thing to do. And that is what the Buddhist world, like at least of Japan, Korea, and China, I don't know anything about China anymore. I'm really annoyed with China for hanging on to Tibet in such a foolish way. I don't go into China. I've turned down a number of invitations because I know if I get inside of China and then I start mouthing off about Tibet, my sponsors will get in deep trouble. I won't get in trouble, but they will. And so I go as far as Hong Kong or as far as Seoul, and then I don't go into the mainland anymore. That's another story too, but I will just say the young people in China have all been taught that Tibet, in school, that Tibet has always been part of China. Yeah. I've talked to a lot of the young students who came from China to the University of California at Davis. These are the educated ones, and they all believe that too. When I realized that, I understood how difficult it's going to be, because the educated Chinese populace even is for the most part convinced that Tibet really should be theirs. I know better than that, but it's going to be an uphill struggle. Okay, so that's practice.
That's a good one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Chris Parr.
Gary, place is very important to you, as we heard in the Gion poem. I'm a New Zealander. I'm from Christchurch in Auckland.
You're from where?
Christchurch and Auckland in New Zealand, which shares the Pacific Ocean with the city of San Francisco. You were born in San Francisco, and you've lived most of your American life in Northern California.
Actually, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest.
In the Northwest, yeah, north of here. So I'm interested to know how you think about this area, this region, this place, in relationship to its diversity of religious cultures. It has some that are very old, Spanish, Eurocentric. It has some that are much more recent, Polynesian, Mormon, Asian, and so forth, your own interest in Pure Land and Zen. How do you think now at this time about San Francisco as a place, as something of a melting pot, a nexus of religious communities and communities in general?
How big a region do you think of when you think of a region here?
I'll let you decide that. I know you think bioregionally, so
Yeah,
you can
okay. I
take
just
that as
wondered
you
if
want
I
to.
can talk about a good chunk of the whole Pacific slope.
Okay. You're our
I think
visitor.
the West Coast, as I know it, is the Pacific slope from Haida Gwaii, the Queen Charlotte Islands, south through western British Columbia, and then down Washington, Oregon, and into Northern California, as far south as maybe south of the Big Sur River, down south of San Luis Obispo, as far south as salmon will run up the streams. So like the coast is the coast of the salmon coast. When you get too far south, the water is warmer and there's no more salmon. That also constitutes basically the range of the Pacific species of the Douglas fir. And that shapes a lot of the culture and economy of the pre-white people here too, all of that. But interestingly, in recent years, that is to say the last 150 years, people have been aware that the Pacific slope, the western slope, is also one of the most politically liberal parts of the whole nation, regardless of education or not. It is the part of the United States that almost always votes Democratic, has the least percentage of church-going people in the country, was very strongly Union, especially around Seattle, through the Depression and up through World War II, and was the scene of a number of experimental communities going back to the 1890s, starting in British Columbia and coming all the way down to Central California. So it has a kind of a cultural quality, a cultural and political history that is rather its own. And when I was a young college graduate, moving out of graduate school back in the Midwest and resettling in the Bay Area, my mentor in those matters were Robert Duncan and Kenneth Rexroth, two great, very radical figures in the culture of this area. And Kenneth made it very clear that what distinguished this, especially Northern California, from the East Coast right after World War II was the attitude towards Stalin and toward the Communist Party. The West Coast left wing was anti-Stalinist for the most part, and a lot of anarchists, Italian anarchists, whereas the East Coast had a hard time shaking off, the East Coast Party people had a hard time shaking off their Stalinism. Furthermore, there was no romanticism of the Trotsky splinter group, the Trotskyites on the West Coast. That was also East Coast. I went to both coasts and observed both of those when I was 18, 19. So there is a long political and cultural history here that stands on its own. And that leads into the San Francisco Poetry Renaissance of the 50s, which was Rexroth, Jack Spicer, Robert Duncan, and Robin Blazer really were the leaders in that, with the strong women poets like Diane DePrima and Joanne Kiger coming in right behind that. And then Allen, as I have said, in some seminars, I haven't written it into a book yet, but Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac didn't invent the scene. They came onto it already formed, and they just made it public. That's what they did. And also, since I'm talking a little bit about San Francisco, Robert Duncan, whom many of you may have never heard of, because the East Coast literary establishment has basically blacked him out since he died, whereas on the West Coast we all remember him as, the master poet in a way. He was the first public person to come out of the closet and be a proud, imperious, unapologetic gay. And that was before, just on the dawn of World War II. After World War II, he continued to publish and speak, and he provided a powerful leadership for the gay community, a remarkable leadership. And it is the reason that everybody says, or the reason that it is true, that in a way San Francisco is one of the capitals of the gay world. We can thank Robert Duncan for that, whether you know it or not.
That's cool.
You know, I could go on. There's a whole lot of stuff to be said here. There are more Pacific Islanders living in Los Angeles and in San Francisco than there are in the Pacific Islands. They say there are more Eskimos in LA than there are in most of the far north. And I don't believe Mormons really come over the mountains. They stay on the other side of the mountains where you can grow alfalfa.
They've come in from the Pacific.
Okay.
I know a lot about this stuff, so I can make jokes about it.
Bron, you ready?
I also will say that we're thankful that the French Italians and Swiss Italians found their way into Napa County and Sonoma County early on and learned how to make wine, you know, or brought what they knew already. And Emiliano Vallejo, the last Mexican governor of Northern California, shared his wine-growing expertise with Agustin Harasti, who started the Harasti Cellars. You know, so we have many things to be thankful for. Now, up in the Northwest where I grew up, it was all Scandinavians. That's a different story.
Bron.
And there are people who say, and I think it's maybe still true, San Francisco is a Catholic town. And if you want to get ahead in San Francisco, you go to the University of San Francisco, and you know the right people, and then you can get into being the mayor or something. That used to be true. And the only reason I ever joined and put my money in the Bank of America was that it was an Italian bank in those days, founded by A.P. Giannini, with his portrait in every branch of the Bank of America, in every branch in the city of San Francisco. If I had known that they were going to sell out and move to North Carolina, I would never have done it.
Great.
Okay.
Gary, thanks for the 1993 interview, which was, in more than 20 years of interviewing folks, is and remains my favorite. I'm going to play off of that in my question to you today. After talking about how you were kind of a natural animist as a child, very open to other creatures, and saying that this is common cross-culturally among children, you continued, what's not common is the mind-body dualism that begins to come in with monotheism, and the alliance of monotheism with the formation of centralized governance in the nation-state. That's what's unnatural and statistically a minority on Earth. Only a small proportion of people on Earth have been monotheists. You continued that monotheism and nationalism do seem to go together. Jews and Muslims are the only pure monotheists. Christians hold it in a very qualified and tricky way. Everybody else in the world is a multifaceted polytheist, animist, or Buddhist who sees things in the world not as dead matter, but as interconnected, as having continuity with life, as having value. I was wondering if you could give us an updated riff on your views of animism and bioregionalism, and why they are preferable to monotheism and nationalism, and speak about whether your views in this regard have strengthened or shifted since our conversation. I also wonder if you think animistic belief, perception, and ethics, including those based on the scientific study of animal consciousness and behavior, have been gaining strength.
That's a very rich question.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I can't remember it all, but
Animism, bioregionalism, monotheism.
I'll try to take it in a couple of bites. Of course, animism is, in just a general way, a loose term for talking about the consciousness that many indigenous people have, but not only indigenous people, as their fundamental spiritual and religious stand. Their consciousness that says there's some kind of life going on all around us all the time. It is not necessarily terribly specifically thought out, but it is a feeling that there is a life in things, a spirit in things, and that we better acknowledge it to some degree. That is exactly what Japanese Shinto is, folk Shinto, pre-20th century state Shinto that was a kind of a reorganized and rebuilt Shinto for the purposes of Japanese nationalism, and which was more or less eradicated as part of the surrender and the occupation of the American government. So state Shinto does not exist anymore, although the grand shrine for the imperial family of Japan, the Ise Shrine, is still there and is still going. And the Yasukuni Shrine, which is very controversial, the shrine to the Japanese war dead, is still visited regularly. And there's a certain number of right-wing fanatics that hang out there all the time. If you ever want to see that, you can just walk up the sidewalk into the Yasukuni Shrine. But it's really animism. I was told recently by a friend of mine who's got a lot of history in Taiwan, how one of her mother's friends, who's an Aboriginal woman, you know, Western Taiwan has a number of Aboriginal tribes that live in the mountains, and that there are about 15 mountain peaks over 9,000 feet high in Western Taiwan. And then all the rice growing is in Eastern Taiwan. The rice growing is all on the western side. Anyway, some of the Aboriginal guys fought for the Japanese after World War II, and there was a couple of them that were pilots. So this Taiwanese Aboriginal guy was killed while flying a Japanese fighter plane, and his spirit is enshrined in the Yasukuni Shrine as a Japanese sort of war hero, even though he's not. The Japanese are not sure who is Japanese, except it's not as easy as in China. In China, you can be a Chinese if you wear the right clothes and know Confucius. That's all it takes. Anyway, this woman went up to the Yasukuni Shrine. She said, I want to get my cousin's spirit back from the Yasukuni Shrine. They put his spirit up there, and I don't think he really wants to be there. So she applied to the shrine headquarters to do that. And the shrine headquarters said, well, you know, there's a branch of the government that actually takes care of that. So she went to the government, and they said, I'm sorry, we cannot release any spirits from the Yasukuni Shrine to you. And so she asked, and went back to Taiwan, and she asked a guy down there who was kind of a shaman, I guess, what am I going to do? And he said, oh, pay no attention, we'll get it back ourselves. He said, I'll do a ceremony and it'll come back. In folk Shinto, the spirits are almost 100% formless. They have no shape. You can't see them. Maybe they might look at you once in a while, but you can't see them. They have no form. That's an interesting thing. And it's parallel with everything on the West Coast and quite a ways inland here with American Indians, that the spirits are formless beings, formless powers, but there is something of that spirit in almost everything, certainly in all living beings. And the difficulty is it goes to understanding what gods mean. The Ainu of northern Japan said very clearly, and still say, animals are all gods. The Japanese said the emperor is a god. And the missionaries from Europe would hear those things and it would make their hair stand up because it's so awful to say that. But what they meant by gods wasn't anything at all like what the Greeks meant by gods, and certainly not like what Christians and Muslims thought about gods. It's a very loose. The problem has been very loose language in regard to these things. When I was a little boy during World War II, one of the things that people wrote about in a deprecating way was those stupid Japanese, they think their emperor is a god. Well, you know, what were they thinking? They were thinking it was something like Jehovah, you know, the Americans. whereas the Japanese didn't mean anything more by that than when the Romans said that their emperor was a god. It just meant he's a big guy with a certain amount of power, and we might as well think of him as being special, but that's all. I have always felt that there was life around me to a greater degree than some people. I've always felt that it does no harm to say thank you in a lot of circumstances where normally you wouldn't be, it wouldn't be thought that you would say it, like thank you to rocks and boulders, either for moving nicely or for staying put, for both. Certainly you should apologize to a big boulder if you move it to another place, or at least explain why you're doing it. It does no harm, and it'll probably make you feel better. So that extends widely. In our Sangha up in the mountains in the Sierra Nevada, when the British put several 100,000 cows to death because of the danger of mad cow disease, after a couple of weeks of being aware of that, we did a sutra service for the dead British cows. And, you know, that was nice. We felt good about that. We did, and it wasn't foolish, and it wasn't that we were trying to win some kind of karmic points. It was that something was unfinished if you don't do that. It's as simple as that. Does that help at all, Bron?
That's right. Yeah, that's a great start, but we can let others in too now.
Yeah. Okay, now bioregionalism. All right. Yeah, thank you for reminding me. I was over at Naropa a few days ago talking to that predominantly Tibetan practice group about some of these things. And this very same topic of animism came up. It's a complex topic, and it's hard to talk about it in the basement of the Marriott Hotel. Especially when I think what's above us here, actually, is the Yerba Buena Park. 2 stories up, or 2 levels up, and then you're out in the park. Now, how did the Marriott Hotel people arrange it so that they could excavate this first to have it underground and then put the city park on top of it? Did they do any ceremonies? You know, I mean, give this a credit to the Japanese for this. They build some remarkable high-rise buildings, some of the tallest skyscrapers anywhere now, and most ingenious architecture. And still, every building in Tokyo is built with a Shinto ceremony telling the earth goddess spirit that might be right where they're going to put that building, that they respect her and know her and hope she won't mind while they put a building there. And you can drive down you can be walking on the street or driving down the street, and you'll see these yellow-robed and red-robed Shinto priests with these funny tall hats doing the little ceremony for the earth goddess where the building construction is going to begin. That's part of it, too. I'm superstitious, I guess. I think it's good luck to do those things. So the question in Naropa was, what can we here do in Boulder along the Rocky Mountain front with animism? Does it have any meaning to us? And I said, yeah, you've got Boulder Creek running through here. Your local spirits are your local rivers and your local ridges and ranges. To be a bioregionalist is right there a gesture of deep respect and gratitude to a place, and starts formalizing that gratitude. That spirit continues when you adopt an attitude of etiquette to the rest of the natural world and not only say hello to your human neighbors, which is a good idea, but say a brief little hello to the Kenyan wren, or the yellow-backed warbler, or the crow, or the raven, or whatever else you happen to note, anything your eye falls on, plant, animal, mineral, to note it and to say hello. and it maybe even know the names. It's very polite to know the names, even though they're probably the wrong names. But we're going to have to change all those names too. Well, there is a pardon me. There is a policy in Alaska now, that you cannot make any more place names without consulting native names first, because so many places that are named after somebody's girlfriend down in the lower 48 actually already had a name. Okay.
No, I was just going to say maybe we have time for one question from the floor. David Barnhill, I don't know if you'd like to do one. Yeah, I think they do. Thanks.
Throughout your life, you have articulated compellingly a radical critique of our society and an ideal that is fundamentally different from what we have. That seems to lead us into what we could call a radical paradox. If we work towards that ideal, we can't get there from here, and we're ignoring the problems on the ground right now. If we work on the short-term things we can make effect on, we could get distracted from the ideal and maybe even reinforce what's going on now. How do you respond to that, and how does Buddhism help you respond to that?
Can you tell me what he said?
You better repeat it, because I didn't quite get. What's the gist?
The gist is...
Well, you know, your microphone is really fuzzy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It goes with my head. It's also fuzzy. How about I do this?
It's okay. Use the mic
come
now.
up
They
here.
fixed it. They fixed it.
They fix it? Okay. So, you have been a radical critic of our society and have articulated a profound ideal that's fundamentally different.
Yeah, a little farther away from the mic. Thank you. Try it now.
Wow. So, you have articulated,
Yeah.
is that okay?
Yes.
A radical critique of our society and an ideal, bioregional ideal, that's fundamentally different than what we have now.
Yeah.
So the question is, as you put it, what is to be done? If we work on the ideal, we may in fact be ignoring what's really going on now, and we may not be able to get there from here. If we work on the contemporary problems on the ground now, we may be distracted from heading towards that ideal. So how do you deal with this problem of being a radical and trying to create change right now, but also aimed towards that kind of ideal that you have? And how does Buddhism help with that?
The way you do it is be clever. No, you have to have some political and cultural savvy. If you want to accomplish something, you don't create enemies that you don't need. This is all, really very basic stuff. To move towards the bioregional ideal would follow you would proceed in the same terms as the old motto of the industrial workers of the world: forming the new society within the shell of the old. And some of it is simply educational. People around the bay here love to be told when whales have come into the bay and gone out again. They love to get the news that the striped bass are beginning to run in again and that the salmon are going up the Sacramento River again. They have become more aware now than they ever were in the past of the Pacific Coast Flyway and the fact that tens of thousands of migrating hawks fly right over San Francisco every season. Those little educational things are part of moving the society in a slightly different direction towards being more aware of who it is and where it is and taking better care of it. Working along the same lines in a different way are the government agencies that deal with water and air and soil and have their own kinds of legislation dealing with water pollution. Sometimes, this is one of the battles in politics right now about what kind of regulation, environmental regulation, will be tolerated. But I'm sure you're aware of the many decades that the argument over Delta water has been going on. And part of the argument is a matter of preserving the existence of the delta smelt. Is the delta smelt a little fish worth saving? You know, that's a question that some people might worry about, but it's really not just the delta smelt. It is the whole question of how we regard our water coming through. And your bioregional musicians and poets, on the one side, can make common cause and be of some use to the people up in Sacramento or in Washington, D.C., who are working with water policy, public resource policy. We find ways to do that all the time. There is a little watershed group now that does a special program every September for Strawberry Creek, which is the creek that flows to the university on Berkeley campus. Then it dives down and goes underneath the ground for many, many blocks through the downtown Berkeley. They do a little thing every year for it, read poems for it, and they go down to where it is daylighted again and comes out so you can see the water again. And they talk to the stream. They say, "We hope that we'll be able to see more of you in the future." This does not offend anybody, hardly, shouldn't, and it lays the groundwork for what would be political choices later. We do not have to reorganize the boundaries of the states of the United States into bioregional boundaries probably for several centuries yet. It'll come about all in its own time. And so simply helping people become more comfortable with the place they are and to know what the place they are is and to know what its parameters are is a wonderful teaching right there. The first thing I taught my students at Davis, if they were from out of the state, was, my poetry students, was, you are now in a Mediterranean climate. Do not expect any summer, any rain from June to October. Most of them had never heard that before. There's a lot of Californians who don't know why we have a summer drought, and that is the cause of many differences. Somebody went and talked to Hewlett-Packard in a big way when they moved up to Roseville, and they told Hewlett-Packard, you know, you won't spend nearly as much money on water if you do your landscaping with California native plants. And the Hewlett-Packard people said, well, why is that? California native plants live without water all summer. That's it. So now, as against 15 years ago, there are dozens of California native plant nurseries where you can go and get these plants here in Northern California. 15 years ago, that was an outrageous and new idea. So yeah, we're making progress within the shell of the old. Okay.
Will you join me in thanking Gary Snyder?
Thank you.